Oh, hey, didn't see you there. Well, I guess we'll start the show. Today on The Story Unfolds, I have a wonderful little poem to discuss titled The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. To start out this poem, one of which is probably the most famous of all Poe's work, we start off with the unnamed narrator who is alone in his study on a cold December night, trying not to think about his beloved Lenore, who has recently passed away. When suddenly he hears a quick knock at his door but decides not to entertain it. Though he tries to pretend that nothing is there, his curiosity is boiling up inside and he eventually opens his door. Asking if Lenore is there, suddenly he hears tapping at his window and opens it just for a raven to come flying in. Landing on a bust of Pallas, of which is the Greco-Roman goddess of wisdom and learning. The narrator jokingly asks the raven's name, and is surprised to hear it respond, "Nevermore." In extreme shock, as someone who just saw a raven speak should be, the narrator mutters to himself that the raven will likely leave him just like his friends and loved ones did. Ouch. To which the raven responds again, "Nevermore." The narrator then sits in front of the bird, trying to understand what nevermore really means. Suddenly, the narrator gets the idea that angels sent by God have caused the air to become dense and perfumed. In a situation like this, especially at the time, it's not very explainable. One could easily search for answers in anything, especially religion. Anxious, the narrator asks the raven if the angels are a sign that heaven will relieve him of his sorrows, to which the bird says again, "Nevermore." With the same response, the bird rejects his hope that he might see Lenore again in heaven. Finally, the narrator tells us that the raven has continued to sit atop his chamber door above the bust of Pallas, and that he will live forever in its shadow. When looking at the poem, you must ask yourself whether what happens is supernatural or subconscious. Here's a direct quote from the poem, in fact the opening line. "Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore." Although the narrator began the poem trying to forget Lenore, in a moment of irrational hope, he allows himself to wonder if she could possibly have returned from the dead. Suddenly it's clear that the narrator, while fearful, also wants the supernatural. He can't escape the memories of his lost love and desperately wants her to return, even if it's as a ghost, ghoul, or even just in his head. But now the nothing more is turned against him to crush those hopes. Earlier he used the phrase to assert rationality, but now that he is hopeful of his lost love's supernatural return, the real world asserts itself and he is forced to realize that his love is nevermore. The cold, dark December night, the book of forgotten lore, and the sudden knock establish a gothic mood. Also, here the poem introduces the fact that the narrator is grief-stricken over his dead love, Lenore, and is trying to escape that grief by reading. The fire, too, is dying. The poem vividly establishes its concerns with death and memory, and casts memory, good and bad, of both his dead love and the raven, not as something desired, but as a burden the narrator wishes he could escape but can't. The fact that he has to assure himself at all of what is happening indicates his uncertainty of whether he is even awake. Both his rationality and doubt are on display. The narrator's relentless questions, despite the fact that the raven always answers the same, show how the narrator's rationality has just failed in helping him understand the bird, but pushed him to despair and on the brink of madness. First, in his fervor to understand the bird's meaning, he has lost sight of the fact that the bird might not have any meaning at all, and that its words might just be nonsense. Once he gives that up, his mind slips into a kind of interpretive frenzy, finding meaning in everything, and seeing the raven's nevermore as denying all hopes of reuniting with his beloved Lenore. He's fallen down a rabbit hole, trying to figure out the unexplainable, the raven, and death. And with each failure only tries harder until now, when he erupts in fury and despair. The framing of the poem as a memory emphasizes how the events of the poem continue to haunt him, especially with the final words being, and the raven never flitting, still is sitting, on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamp lights o'er him, streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.